She thought she was just a lowly kitchen maid, sneaking her own meager dinners to 3 starving, shivering children hiding in the palace woodpile. She believed the entire world had forgotten them, but she was wrong. Every single night, hidden deep in the freezing shadows, the most powerful and feared man in the realm watched her every move. She never suspected those abandoned orphans belonged to the Alpha King, and she had no idea that by saving his broken family, she was about to become the heart of his. The kitchen yard smelled of rotting apples and wood smoke. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter, the gray wool rough against her neck, and counted the leftover bread in her basket. 3 crusts, 1 heel, and a wedge of cheese no one would miss. The cooks had already gone inside to warm their hands by the fire, leaving her to carry the scraps to the pig trough. That was her place, the one who cleaned up what others forgot. She was halfway across the cobblestones when she heard it. A small sound, barely more than a breath. Someone was crying behind the woodpile, the kind of crying that tried very hard to be silent. Margaret stopped. She knew that sound. She had made it herself once, long ago, in a different kitchen, in a different life. She set the basket down and walked toward the shadows. 3 pairs of eyes looked up at her. 2 little girls with hair the color of straw, and a boy who could not have been more than 7, holding his sister's hand too tightly. Their clothes were clean but thin, their faces smudged with dirt. They looked like children who had learned not to ask for anything. "Are you lost?" Margaret asked softly. The boy shook his head. The smaller of the 2 girls opened her mouth, but the boy squeezed her hand, and she closed it again. They had been taught to be quiet. Someone had taught them that no one wanted to hear them. Margaret did not push. She simply knelt down, there on the cold stones, and opened my basket. "I have more bread than I can eat," she said, which was not true. "And I hate eating alone." The boy stared at her. His eyes were gray, like winter sky. Something in Margaret's chest tightened. She pulled out the heel of bread, broke it into 3 pieces, and held them out. The children did not move. They looked at the bread, then at her. They puffed at each other. Hunger warred with caution. "It's warm," she said. "The oven was still hot when I took it out." The smaller girl reached first. Her fingers closed around the bread like it was made of gold. She took 1 bite, then another, then shoved the whole piece into her mouth, chewing with a desperate speed that made Margaret's throat ache. The other girl followed more slowly. The boy held his piece for a long moment, then tore it in half and gave part to his sister, who had already finished hers. That was the moment. Margaret felt something shift inside her, like a door opening in a room she had forgotten existed. She sat down on the ground, right there in the dirt, and pulled her shawl around the smallest girl. "Slow down," she murmured. "The bread isn't going anywhere, and neither am I." The children ate. Margaret watched them, and she sang. It was an old song, her mother's song, about the harvest moon and the geese flying south. She did not know why she sang it, perhaps because it was the only thing she had to give that did not cost anything at all. In the shadows at the far end of the yard, a man stood perfectly still. He had come to the kitchens the way he always did, walking the back paths of his own castle like a stranger. The guards knew not to speak of it. The servants had learned not to see him. He was the Alpha King, William of House Ashford, and no one dared ask why he wandered the servants' quarters at dusk. He saw the woman in the gray apron sitting on the ground with his children. He saw her break her bread and give it away. He saw his son Tom look at her the way Tom used to look at his mother. Something in William's chest cracked, quietly, like ice on a frozen pond. He had not let himself look at his children in months. He had told himself it well.
Think easier that way. Easier to rule a kingdom than to fail a family. The woman looked up. For one terrible moment her eyes met his across the yard. William did not move. He could have stepped forward. He could have said something, anything, claimed them, ended this strange and tender scene. But he did not. He saw the way his smallest daughter leaned into the woman's shawl, the way his son let go of his sister's hand. He stepped back into the shadows. The woman lowered her eyes first. She was only a servant, after all. She knew better than to stare at a man of his bearing, even in the dim light. She turned back to the children and said something he could not hear, and the smallest girl laughed. It was the first time William had heard that laugh in over a year. It came out of her like a bird released from a cage. He touched the scar above his left eyebrow, an old habit. Then he turned and walked away, his boots silent on the cobblestones. Behind him, the woman began to gather her basket. The boy was helping her, small hands reaching for the breadcloth. William heard him say, "Thank you," in a voice that was trying very hard to be grown up. Margaret looked at the boy. She wanted to ask his name. She wanted to ask where his mother was, why his clothes were so thin, why no one had come looking for him. But she had been a servant long enough to know that some questions were not hers to ask. So she just said, "You are welcome," and tucked the breadcloth into his pocket. "For tomorrow," she said. "Don't tell anyone where you got it. Some people don't like kindness that doesn't belong to them." The boy nodded, solemn as a little king. He took his sister's hands and led them back toward the far wall, where a gap in the stone led to the abandoned garden. Margaret watched Theda and them go. She wondered who they were. She wondered why no one fed them. She wondered why her hands were shaking. That night, in her narrow bed under the eaves, she dreamed of gray eyes and a cracked voice saying thank you. She did not know that in the great hall, a man with the same gray eyes sat alone before a cold fire, thinking about a woman who had given away her last piece of bread. He did not know her name, but he knew her face. He would know it anywhere. In the morning, Margaret found a small pouch of silver coins under her pillow. There was no note. She turned it over in her hands, frowning. She was only a kitchen maid. No one left gifts for kitchen maids. She hid the pouch in her apron pocket and went to work, telling herself it was a mistake, telling herself not to hope. But all day she kept thinking about the boy's gray eyes. And all day, at the other end of the castle, the Alpha King kept thinking about the woman who had dated children when he could not bring himself to look at them. The second day passed the way all days passed in the kitchen of Thornwick. Stew bubbling, bread rising, the scullery boy dropping a ladle and Greta's voice rising with it. Margaret scrubbed the same pot until her knuckles ached, and she told herself the silver pouch in her apron pocket was a dream. But her eyes kept drifting to the gap in the wall where the children had vanished the evening before. The bread she had given them was gone. The cold was not. Frost had crept over the courtyard stones overnight, and she had seen the thinness of their clothes, the bareness of their feet. At midday, when the other servants sat down to their own meal, Margaret took her portion, a heel of brown bread, a slice of hard cheese, and wrapped it in her apron. Greta watched her from the hearth, but said nothing. Greta always said nothing, and that was how Margaret knew she was being watched. She found them in the same place, huddled behind the woodpile where the shadows were deepest. The boy saw her first and pulled the girls closer, his narrow shoulders squaring like a soldier's. Margaret did not crouch right away. She knelt at a distance, unwrapped the bread slowly, and broke it into 4 pieces. "I only have 3 hands," she said softly, "so you'll have to come take it yourselves." The boy hesitated. The smaller twin, Lily, though Margaret did not know it yet, tugged at his sleeve. He looked at Margaret's face, at the steam rising from the bread in the cold air, and made a decision that would change both their lives. He stepped forward. The girls followed. Up close, they were even thinner than she had thought. The boy's wrists were like twigs wrapped in a too large shirt that might once have been fine linen. The girls wore patched wool shifts, and their cheeks were smudged with soot and hunger. Margaret did not ask their names. She simply handed each a piece of bread and sat down in the dirt beside them. "My name is Margaret," she said, biting into her own quarter. "I work in the kitchen. I have a very old, very loud friend named Greta who makes the best soup in the kingdom, and if you come at this hour, there will usually be something left." The boy chewed slowly, watching her the way a wild animal watches a stranger, ready to bolt. "Tom," he said at last, "they're Lily and Rose." "Hello, Tom." "Hello, Lily. Hello, Rose." Margaret nodded to each in turn. "That's a good, strong name, Tom, and Lily and Rose are beautiful names for beautiful girls." Rose, the smaller twin, smiled around her bread. Margaret's heart cracked open a little more. They finished the bread, things like silence. Margaret did not press them with questions. She could see the wariness in Tom's eyes, the way he positioned himself between her and his sisters.
Someone had taught him to guard them. Someone had taught him the world was dangerous. When they had eaten, Tom looked at the ground. "We're not supposed to be here." "I know. We're not supposed to talk to anyone. I guess that too." He looked up at her, frowning. "Then why do you keep feeding us?" Margaret considered the question. She could have said because hunger is hunger, or because children should not have to beg for food, but what came out was simpler and truer. "Because I know what it is to be hungry," she said. "Not just for bread, for someone to notice you're there." Tom's jaw tightened. For a moment, Margaret thought he might cry, but he only nodded, tucked the corner of the cloth she had brought into his pocket, and took his sister's hands. "We have to go," he said. "Same time tomorrow," Margaret said. "If you can." He did not answer, but he looked back once, over his shoulder, and that look said more than words. She was still sitting on the cold ground when she heard the sound of an axe splitting wood, clean, rhythmic strokes that did not belong to the kitchen staff. She stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt, and there, at the far end of the courtyard, stood a man she had never seen before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow and gray eyes that caught the pale autumn light. He wore plain soldier's clothes, a worn leather jerkin, rough wool breeches, sleeves rolled to the elbow. A pile of split wood grew at his feet, and he swung the axe with a practiced ease that spoke of years of training. Margaret had seen soldiers before, the castle was full of them, but something about this one made her pause. He was too still between swings, too watchful. When he noticed her looking, he did not look away like the other men did. He held her gaze, and she felt a strange heat rise to her cheeks. "You're new," she said, and winced at how flat it sounded. "Just arrived." He drove the axe into the block and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Name's Arthur. The steward said the woodpile needed splitting." "It does." Margaret hesitated. "We're short on firewood for the kitchen, with the cold coming. Greta's been complaining for a week." "Then I'll split enough to keep her quiet." Margaret smiled before she could stop herself. It was a small thing, but the man. Arthur looked at it like it was something precious. Then he picked up the axe again, and she had the strange feeling she was being dismissed. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen, her heart beating faster than it should have. She told herself it was just surprise, just the novelty of a new face. But when she reached the door and glanced back, Arthur was watching her. Not the wood, her. Inside, Greta was waiting with her arms crossed. "Talking to the new soldier, are we?" "He split the wood for us," I thanked him. "Mm-mm." Greta's eyes were sharp. "And the bread you took, the cheese, you thanked that too? Or did you feed it to the garden rats?" Margaret felt her face go red. I was young once, girl." Greta turned back to her pot, stirring with a heavy hand. "I know what it looks like when someone's feeding more than her own mouth. Just be careful. This castle has eyes in the walls, and not all of them are friendly." Margaret said nothing. She picked up a knife and began chopping onions, her mind full of gray eyes and thin wrists and a boy who carried his sisters like a shield. She did not know she was being watched from a window high above the courtyard. A window where a man in a dark red cloak stood motionless, his gray eyes fixed on her bent head. He had watched her feed his children again. He had watched her smile at a soldier who did not exist. And for the first time in a year, William of House Ashford felt something other than cold. He did not know what to call it, but he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that he would watch her again tomorrow. The third morning came with a bite in the air, and Margaret woke before the first bell, as she always did. She lay still for a moment, staring at the cracked ceiling of her small room above the kitchen, and thought about 3 thin faces huddled in the shadows of the woodpile. The bread she had given them yesterday would be long gone by now. She had no extra ration today. The larder was counted, every loaf weighed and recorded by the steward's clerk. But her own dinner bowl was hers to do as she pleased, and she had learned long ago that a woman could stretch a meal a long way if she did not insist on being full. The day passed in the usual hurry of pots and flames and shouted orders. Greta kept her close, muttering about the early frost and the cost of firewood. But her sharp old eyes followed Margaret more than the boiling pots. Twice Margaret caught her staring, and twice Greta looked away without a word. By late afternoon, the kitchen had quieted. The evening meal for the household was served, the dishes scraped and stacked, the fires banked low for the night. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter and slipped out the back door with a small clay pot tucked under her arm. The pot held the last of the day's barley porridge, thinned with water and sweetened with a single spoonful of honey he'd saved from her own cup. It was not much, but it was warm, and warmth was its own kind of food. The children were where she had hoped they would be, pressed together in the narrow gap between the woodpile and the castle's outer wall. The boy, Tom, heard her first. He straightened, and for a moment his face held something that was not fear. It was watchfulness, yes, but beneath it, something softer, almost like hope. "Margaret," he said, and the sound of her name in his mouth made her chest ache. She knelt and set the pot down between them. The little girls woke at the smell, blinking and pushing themselves up on thin arms. Lily's hair was tangled with straw. Rose had a scratch across her cheek that had not been there before. "Eat," Margaret said, lifting the lid so the steam curled into the cold air. "Eat while it's hot. There's honey in it." They did not need to be told twice. Tom went first, not for himself, but to test the heat, blowing on the spoon before he pressed it to Rose's mouth. The little girl's eyes went wide, and she made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Lily leaned in, and Tom fed her next, and only then did he take a bite for himself. Margaret watched them, and she felt the old, familiar ache rise in her throat. She had seen hunger before. She had been hungry herself more times than she cared to count. But this was different. This was hunger that had learned to be silent, hunger that had made a boy of 7 a father to his sisters. "Do you have a place to sleep?" she asked quietly. Tom nodded toward the woodpile. "We stay behind the logs. There's a hollow. The wind doesn't reach it." Margaret looked at the gap between the stacked wood and the stone wall. It was barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. The ground would be cold and damp, and the frost had already begun to creep across the courtyard stones. "Wait here," she said, and she stood and hurried back toward the kitchen. Greta had gone to her quarters, and the other servants were in the great hall, clearing the last of the tables. Margaret moved quickly, her hands sure. From the rag bin behind the scullery she pulled an old woolen cloak, patched and faded but still thick, and a square of oiled canvas that had been used to cover the bread trough. She folded both into a bundle and tucked a small cloth-wrapped package inside, a piece of hard cheese and a handful of dried apples she had saved from her own stores. When she returned to the woodpile, she did not speak. She simply knelt and pushed the bundle through the gap into the hollow, where the children had huddled down again. Tom's hand found the wool, and his breath caught. "It's cold tonight," Margaret said. "You'll need it." She did not wait for thanks. She stood, straightened her skirt, and walked back toward the castle. But she had not gone 3 steps before a small hand caught the edge of her apron. She turned. Tom stood there, his chin lifted, his eyes bright in the fading light. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything at all. He simply pressed something into her hand, a smooth, round stone, gray and cool, with a faint white vein running through it like a river. "For you," he said. And then he was gone, slipping back into the hollow before she could speak. Margaret closed her fingers around the stone. It was warm from his palm. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she tucked it into the pocket of her apron, next to the old silver spoon, and walked back to the castle with her head bowed. She did not see the tall figure standing in the shadow of the far wall, and soldier's rough tunic over his broad shoulders, his gray eyes fixed on her retreating back. He had been watching for a long time. He had watched her kneel in the dirt and feed his children with her own hands. He had watched her give them her cloak, her cheese, her dried apples. He had watched her take the stone and hold it like it was a treasure. William of House Ashford had not spoken to his children in over a year. He had told himself it was because the pain was too great, because he could not bear to see his wife's eyes looking out at him from their faces. He had told himself it was kinder to stay away, that they were better off without the weight of his grief. But watching Margaret now, he knew the truth. He had been a coward. He had let his own hunger for solitude become their starvation. "Your Majesty," the voice came from behind him, low and careful. William did not turn. He knew it was Greta, the old cook, who had served his household for 30 years and feared nothing. "You've been watching her," Greta said. "She doesn't know who you are." "No," William said, "and she must not know, not yet. Why?" He was silent for a long moment. The wind moved through the courtyard, carrying the first sharp scent of snow. "Because," he said at last, "I am not ready for her to see me as I am. I want her to see me as I could be." Greta made a sound that was half a sigh, half a laugh. She drew her shawl tighter and turned away. "Then you'd best learn to be that man, Your Majesty, because that girl is the kind who feeds the world from her own bowl. She won't wait forever for a king to find himself." She left him standing there, alone in the gathering dark. William watched the hollow in the woodpile where his children slept, wrapped in a patched wool cloak that smelled of a kitchen and of kindness. And for the first time in a long, long while, he wished he knew how to be that kind of warm. The wind turned sharp overnight, and by the fourth morning a thin skin of frost had crept across the kitchen windows. Margaret woke before dawn, as always, but this time she did not reach for her apron first. She reached for the pocket of her old woolen dress, where the smooth gray stone sat warm against her fingers. She had checked on the children twice during the night. Once at midnight when she had crept out with a bucket of kitchen ash to spread over the damp ground around their hollow, hoping to keep some warmth in. Once again at the third hour, when she had pressed her ear to the crack between the logs and heard only the soft, even breathing of sleep. But this morning, when she carried the breakfast scraps out to the woodpile, something was wrong. Lily was coughing. It was a small, tight sound buried in the girl's chest like a trapped bird. Rose sat beside her sister, rubbing her back with a hand that looked far too small for the job. Tom stood at the mouth of the hollow, his jaw set in a way that reminded Margaret, briefly and painfully, of a man trying not to cry. "She coughed all night," Tom said, without greeting. "She says her chest hurts when she breathes." Margaret knelt down, ignoring the cold mud soaking through the knees of her dress. She touched Lily's forehead with the back of her hand and felt the heat rising off the girl's skin like steam from a pot. "Have you been drinking water?" she asked gently. Lily nodded, then coughed again, a wet, rattling sound that made Margaret's stomach clench. She had bread and cheese in her basket, meant for their breakfast. She set it down without a thought and pulled her own shawl off her shoulders, wrapped it around Lily's trembling frame. "Tom, I need you to keep her warm, both of you. Stay close to her. I'll be back as soon as I can." She did not run. Running would draw attention, and attention was the one thing none of them could afford. But she walked fast, her worn boots slapping against the cobblestones, and she was already planning as she went. There was dried elderflower in the pantry, honey in the stores, a pot she could borrow if she was careful, and if Greta asked questions, she would tell the truth, that she had found a sick child, and that no one, not even a king, could argue with a child's fever. She was so focused on her plan that she almost walked straight into the man standing at the corner of the kitchen wall. It was the silent stranger, the one with the scarred eyebrow and the dark cloak, the one she had seen watching the hollow on the first day. He stood with a heavy iron hinge in one hand and a small leather tool roll in the other, looking at the cracked doorframe of the old storehouse beside the kitchen. Margaret stopped short. "Oh, I'm sorry. He looked up. His gray eyes were calm, unreadable, the same way they had been that first day. But there was something else there now, something she could not quite name. "The door's broken," he said. "I'm fixing it." "Right," she hesitated. She should walk away. She had no time for this. But the fever in Lily's chest was burning at the back of her mind, and the stranger was standing between her and the pantry door. "Do you know anything about fevers?" He blinked. For a moment the mask of calm slipped, and she saw something raw underneath, something almost hungry. "A little," he said carefully. "Why?" Margaret made a decision. It was reckless, and she knew it. But the wind was cold, and Lily's tea was wet, and there was no time for caution. "There's a child, a little girl. She's sick, and I need elderflower and honey, and I need someone to hold the pot while I pour if you're not busy." The stranger looked down at the hinge in his hand. then at the broken door frame. Then he set both aside, very deliberately, and straightened to his full height. He was tall, taller than she had realized. The dark cloak made his shoulders look like a wall. "Show me," he said. Margaret led him to the hollow behind the woodpile. She had expected him to hesitate, or to ask questions, or to look at the children with the same cold distance everyone else in the castle seemed to carry. But he did none of those things. He saw Lily shivering in Margaret's shawl, her face flushed with fever. He saw Rose pressed against her sister's side, and Tom standing guard with his small fists clenched, and then he knelt. Margaret had seen many things in her years of service. She had seen lords and ladies, knights and messengers, priests and peddlers, but she had never seen a man kneel in the mud without being asked, without being paid, without any reason at all except that a child was sick. "Hello?" he said to Lily, his voice low and gentle, stripped of the coldness she had heard in it before. "I'm Arthur. I'm going to help you feel better. Is that all right?" Lily looked up at him with her fever-bright eyes. She coughed once, then nodded. "William, Arthur," Margaret reminded herself. His name was Arthur, reached into his tool roll and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Inside were dried herbs, neatly sorted. He chose a handful of something pale green and crushed it between his fingers, releasing a sharp, clean scent that cut through the damp air. "Elderflower," he said. "You were right. It's good for Fev. See, and Hever brought more, but I didn't know." He stopped, and something flickered across his face. "I didn't know who needed it." Margaret did not have time to wonder at that strange pause. She took the crushed herb, mixed it with honey from her basket, and coaxed Lily to swallow the bitter paste. The girl made a face but obeyed, and within a few minutes her coughing eased. Tom watched the whole time with the fierce concentration of a much older boy. When Lily finally relaxed, her head drooping against Rose's shoulder, Tom looked at the stranger, at Arthur, and spoke. "Are you her father?" The question hung in the cold air. Margaret felt her heart stop. She opened her mouth to apologize, to explain that the children had no father, that they were alone in the world and everyone had forgotten them. But Arthur did not look startled. He looked at Tom for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable, and then he said, very quietly, "No, but I know what it's like to wish someone would take care of you." Tom stared at him. Then slowly, he nodded, as if some private judgment had been passed and found in Arthur's favor. Margaret busied herself with the honey pot, her hands trembling slightly. She did not know why the stranger's words had cut so deep. She did not know why she felt like crying. That evening, after the children were settled and the fever had broken enough for Lily to sleep peacefully, Margaret found Arthur sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the courtyard, staring at the dark shape of the woodpile. "That was kind of you," she said, sitting down a careful distance away. "What you did today." He shrugged. "It was nothing." "It wasn't nothing." She looked at him, at the scar over his brow, at the hands that had crushed herbs so carefully. "You didn't have to stay. You didn't have to kneel in the mud, but you did." Arthur was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, like a man who had not used it much. "I had a wife once," he said. "She was kind to people too, kinder than they deserved. I don't always understand why she did the things she did." He paused. "I'm starting to understand now." Margaret did not ask what had happened to his wife. Some doors, she knew, were better left unopened until they were ready to swing wide on their own. "Thank you," she said simply, "for helping her." He turned to look at her then, and in the fading light, his gray eyes held something she could not name, something raw and patient, like a wound that was finally beginning to heal. "You're welcome," he said. And for the first time since the children had appeared in her life, Margaret felt like she was not carrying the weight alone. She did not know who Arthur really was. She did not know why a stranger with a scarred eyebrow and gentle hands had chosen to kneel in the mud for a child he had never met. But as she walked back to the kitchen, the smooth gray stone warm in her pocket, she found herself hoping that she would see him again. She would. The morning came cold and gray, the kind of morning that clung to the bones. Margaret woke before the rooster, as she always did, and the first thing she touched was the smooth gray stone on the table beside her cot. She had meant to return it to him yesterday. She had meant to thank him properly and let the matter rest. Instead, she had carried it to bed like a talisman, and now she turned it over in her fingers, feeling the warmth of yesterday's sun still trapped in its surface. She tucked it into her apron pocket and went about her work. The porridge needed stirring, the bread shaping, the kitchen fires needed feeding. But all morning her hand kept drifting to that pocket, and all morning a small, stubborn hope kept growing in her chest, that she would see him again. She did not have to wait long. Just past midday, when the kitchen was quiet and the other servants had gone to their rest, she heard the sound of hammering coming from the old storeroom door. She rounded the corner with a basket of peelings, and there he was. Arthur, in his plain brown tunic and worn leather gloves, kneeling before the warped wooden door with a plane in his hand, shaving thin curls of wood from the edge. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and something in his face eased. "The latch was sticking," he said. "I thought I'd fix it before winter." "You don't have to do that," she said, though her voice came out softer than she intended. "I know." He returned to his work, running the plane along the wood with a steady, practiced motion. "But it needed doing, and I had nothing else to occupy my hands this morning." She stood there a moment longer than she should have, watching the way his shoulders moved with each stroke, the way he checked the straightness of the edge with his thumb. He was thorough, patient, the kind of man who finished what he started. "Arthur," she said, and he paused. "The children, they asked about you this morning. Lily wanted to know if you would come back." He set the plane down slowly. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, but I hoped." He looked at her then, and there was something in his gray eyes that she could not read. Grief, maybe, or longing, or the shadow of a man who had spent so long alone that he had forgotten how to answer hope. "I lost a child," he said quietly. "A daughter. She would have been about Lia's age." The words fell between them like stones into still water. Margaret's hands went still on the basket. She had seen grief before. She had held the hands of women who had buried children, had watched them crumble and rebuild themselves piece by piece. But this was different. This was a man who had carried his loss alone, so deep inside that no one had ever seen the wound. "I'm sorry," she said, and because she did not know what else to do, she set down the basket and sat on the step beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He did not move away. He stared at the half-plane door for a long moment, then picked up the plane again. But he did not resume working. He simply held it, his thumb tracing the smooth grain of the wood. "She was born in winter," he said, "the smallest thing I had ever seen. I was afraid to hold her, afraid my hands would break her. My wife laughed at me. She said, 'William, you had held a sword in battle, and you are afraid of a child?'" He stopped, and the silence stretched. Margaret did not speak. She did not fill the quiet with empty words. She simply sat beside him, her apron folded over her knees, the gray stone warm against her hip, and let him know that she was there. "She died of the fever when she was 3, he said at last. "My wife never truly recovered from it. None of us did. And after my wife passed, I did not know how to look at the children who were left. Every time I saw them, I saw her. Every time I laughed, I heard the laughter that was missing. So that was it. That was the wound he carried. He had not abandoned his children out of cruelty. He had abandoned them out of fear. The same fear that made him kneel in the mud for Lily's fever. The same fear that made him fix a door he did not need. Fix. "Children are not replacements for the ones we lose," Margaret said softly. "They are their own little souls, and they need us to see them for who they are, not for who we miss." He turned to look at her then, really looked, and for a moment the mask of the plain soldier slipped. She saw the weight of a crown in his bearing, the sorrow of a king who had ruled a kingdom and lost the one thing that mattered. But she did not know what she was seeing. She only knew that this man was carrying more than any one person should have to carry. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you feed them, care for them, love them, knowing they are not yours. Because they are not mine, she said simply. They are children, and children belong to whoever is willing to love them. It does not matter whose blood runs in their veins. What matters is who shows up with bread in the morning. His jaw tightened. He looked down at his hands, at the calluses and the old sword scars that she had not yet learned to read. I have not shown up, he said. Not for anyone. Not for a long time. You are here now, she said. That is a start. They sat together in the quiet of the autumn afternoon, the smell of fresh wood shavings and cold earth around them. After a while, Margaret heard a small sound from the direction of the woodpile. She looked up and saw 3 small heads peeking around the corner. Lily, her cheeks still pale but her eyes bright. Rose, clutching her rag doll, and Tom, standing a little behind his sisters, watching Arthur with that careful, measuring gaze. They came to find you, Margaret said, and she could not keep the smile from her voice. Arthur looked up. For a long moment he did not move. Then he set the plane down, wiped his hands on his tunic, and rose. He walked toward the children, slowly the way one might approach a wild bird, and crouched down so that he was level with Lily. "Hello," he said. "I heard you were feeling better." Lily nodded solemnly. "Margaret said you fixed my fever." "I did," he said, "but you did the hard part. You fought it." Lily considered this, then reached out and touched the scar on his eyebrow with one small finger. "Did that hurt?" "A little," he said. "A long time ago. Does it still hurt?" He smiled, and it was the first real smile Margaret had ever seen on his face. It changed him. It softened the hard lines of his jaw and warmed the gray of his eyes. "No," he said, "it does not hurt any more." And in that moment, standing in the cold autumn light with 3 children gathered around him and a kitchen maid watching from the step, William of House Ashford felt something he had not felt in years. He felt like he was home. The kitchen was loud with the clatter of copper pots when Greta found her. Margaret was scrubbing a heavy iron pan, her sleeves rolled past her elbows, the steam from the wash basin curling her loose strands of hair into damp rings. "Girl?" Greta planted herself by the table, arms crossed over her flour-dusted apron. "I saw you yesterday, in the courtyard talking to that new soldier." Margaret kept scrubbing. "He fixed the storeroom door. I thanked him." "Thanked him?" Greta snorted. "You stood there for half an hour, the 2 of you, heads together like a pair of old hens, and the children, they were climbing all over him. I saw that too." "They like him." Margaret set the pan down, drying her hands on her apron. "He's good with them, Greta. He sits and listens. He doesn't shout." Greta's face softened for just a moment, the way it did when she looked at Margaret after a long day. Think. Then the hardness returned. "I've been in this palace for 40 years, child. I've seen good men and bad men, and men who wore kindness like a coat they could take off when the weather turned. That one." She jabbed a finger toward the window. "He's not what he says he is. I don't know what he is, but he's not a soldier who just wandered in from the road." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but Greta held up her hand. "You're a soft heart, and that's your gift. But soft hearts get broken, and they get the ones they love broken too. Keep your distance, for the children's sake, if not your own." She turned and walked back to the ovens before Margaret could answer. The afternoon passed in a blur of bread and stew and the endless rhythm of the serving hours. Margaret's hands moved through the work, but her mind kept circling back to Greta's words. "He's not what he says he is." She tried to picture Arthur's face, the scar through his brow, the gray eyes that held so much weather. He had told her about his daughter, about his wife. Men who wore kindness like a coat didn't tell you about their dead children. They didn't sit in the cold and let a 3-year-old's memory fill the silence between them. She was carrying a basket of leftover bread to the children's quarters when she passed 2 scullery maids whispering by the well. "They say the king's been in a black mood all week," one said, tucking a strand of hair under her cap. "Threw a platter against the wall this morning at breakfast. No one knows why." "Old Greta says it's the season," the other replied, shrugging. "The dark months always sit heavy on him. Ever since the Queen—" "Shh." The first maid glanced around, her eyes catching Margaret. She pulled her friend by the sleeve, and they hurried off toward the courtyard. Margaret stood still for a moment, the bread basket warm against her hip. The Queen. She had heard fragments over the years, pieces of a story no one in the palace ever told whole. A queen who had died young. Children, though no one spoke of them. The king had closed the nursery wing years ago, and the servants learned quickly not to ask. She shook her head and walked on. It was none of her business. The king's grief. She had her own small world to tend, 3 small mouths to feed, and a chill in the air that promised an early frost. The children were waiting for her by the woodpile, huddled together on an old bench. Tom was whittling a stick with a dull knife, his dark head bent low. Lily and Rose sat close, sharing a scrap of blanket Margaret had given them 2 weeks ago. "Supper," she said, setting the basket down. "Bread and cheese, and there's still some stew from yesterday if you're hungry." They ate with the quiet, focused hunger she had come to know. Tom always let the girls take the first bites, always checked the bread for mold before tearing it into pieces. A 7-year-old with a father's worry in his eyes. Margaret sat on the ground beside them, pulling her shawl tighter. The wind had picked up, rattling the dry leaves against the stone wall. She watched them eat and thought about what Greta had said. Keep your distance, for the children's sake. But how could distance help children who had been left so far behind already? "Margaret," Ton's voice was quiet, his eyes fixed on the stick in his hands. "That man, Arthur, is he our father?" The question hit her like cold water. Lily looked up, crumbs on her chin, her blue eyes wide. Rose went still, one hand frozen halfway to her mouth. Margaret's throat tightened. She had known the question would come. Had Tan dreaded it since the afternoon Arthur had crouched down and let Lily touch his scar, but she had not prepared an answer. "I don't know, Tom," she said honestly. "I truly don't know who your father is, but I know Arthur is kind to you and he cares about you. That matters, doesn't it?" Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and went back to his whittling, but his shoulders were a little straighter, and Margaret could see him turning the thought over like a stone in his pocket. She was gathering the empty bowls when a shadow fell across the path. She looked up, and there was Arthur, standing at the edge of the yard with a bundle of firewood under one arm. He had been coming more often now, finding small reasons to be near. A broken latch, a loose board, a load of wood that needed splitting. "The cold's coming early," he said, setting the wood down by the shed. "I thought the children might need extra fuel for their fire." "Thank you." She smiled, and the worry from Greta's warding loosened a little in her chest. He looked tired, shadows under his eyes, but his voice was gentle. He helped her carry the wood inside the children's small quarters, stacking it neatly by the hearth. As he bent to set down the last armful, something slipped from the folds of Margaret's apron. A small silver spoon, worn thin at the bowl, the handle engraved with a pattern of interwoven leaves. It clattered onto the stone floor. Arthur went still. Then he bent and picked it up, turning it over in his large hands. The silver caught the firelight, and Margaret saw his fingers, those long, scarred fingers, trace the engraved leaves with a slowness that felt almost reverent. "This is a beautiful piece," he said quietly. His voice had changed, lower, careful. "Where did you get—"
"Missip, my mother's." Margaret stepped closer, holding out her hand. "She was a nurse in a great house before she married my father. It was given to her by the lady of the house. As a keepsake, she left it to me when she died." Arthur's thumb moved over the engraving once more. For a moment, Margaret thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, or memory, or something she could not name. Then he pressed the spoon into her palm, his fingers brushing hers. "It's a good keepsake," he said. "You should keep it close." He straightened, and the mask slipped back into place. The easy soldier's smile she had come to know. But Margaret had been watching people her whole life, reading their moods across a crowded kitchen table, knowing when to step back and when to press forward. Something had changed in him when he held that spoon. She did not know what. She only knew that the man who had crouched in the dirt with her children was suddenly a stranger again, standing a little taller, carrying himself with a weight that had nothing to do with the firewood. He said good night to the children, ruffling Tom's hair, letting Lily press her small hand against his cheek. Then he was gone into the gathering dark, and Margaret stood in the doorway with the silver spoon cooling in her palm.
feeling the shape of a question she did not yet know how to ask. The fever came back with the frost. It crept into Lily's small body sometime past midnight, when the embers in the old servant's hearth had burned down to grey ash and the wind found every crack in the walls. Margaret woke to the sound of shallow breathing, too quick, too thin, and she knew before she touched the child's forehead that the sickness had not truly left. She lit the last candle, its flame small and stubborn again. Lily's cheeks burned like autumn leaves pressed too close to a fire, and her small hands plucked at the blanket as if she were reaching for something just out of sight. "Hush, little one," Margaret whispered, dipping a rag into the cool water she kept by the bed. "I am here. I am not going anywhere." But the water was lukewarm by then, and the pot was empty, and the well sat at the far end of the courtyard under a sky sharp with coming winter. Margaret looked at the sleeping forms of Rose and Tom, curled together for warmth on the pallet across the room. And she made her choice without hesitation. She wrapped her shawl tight, took the bucket, and slipped out into the night. The cold bit through her worn shoes the moment she stepped onto the stones. The courtyard stretched wide and indifferent under the moon, and the well's rope creaked like an old complaint as she drew it up. Ice had formed a thin skin over the bucket by the time she carried it back, and her fingers got numb. But she did not hurry. She could not afford to spill a single drop. She was on her way back through the narrow passage by the wood store when she stopped. The wood was stacked. Neat piles of split logs, dry and seasoned, filled the lean-to that had been nearly empty the day before, and hanging from a nail by the door, a small bundle of dried feverfew and willow bark tied with coarse twine, the way the healers in the outer villages prepared it. Margaret stood very still in the dark. She did not need to ask who had done this. The wood was split with a care that spoke of strong hands and patience. The herbs were tied with a knot she had seen once before, on the pouch of a quiet soldier who had brought her medicine for a sick child not long ago. But there was no sign of him now, only the gift and the silence and the cold. She took the herbs and the wood, and she carried them back to the children without looking over her shoulder. Behind her, at the far edge of the courtyard, a tall shadow remained motionless in the archway of the stables, watching until her light disappeared behind the old servant's door. By dawn, the fever had loosened its grip. Margaret sat on the floor beside Lily's cot, her back against the wall, her eyes gritty from a night without sleep. The feverfew had done its work. The child's breathing had slowed, her cheeks had lost that terrible burning flush, and she slept now with her thumb in her mouth, small and peaceful as a bird after a storm. Rose woke first and patted over, pressing her small hand against her sister's forehead with the solemnity of a much older healer. "She is better," Rose announced, and then, with the directness that always caught Margaret off guard, "Did the soldier man come again?" Margaret hesitated. Her hand went to her apron pocket, where she had tucked the little bundle of herbs after using the last of them. "Why would you ask that?" she said softly. Rose shrugged. "Because he always comes when she is sick. He thinks we do not see him, but we do." She looked up at Margaret with wide, serious eyes. "He stands very far away, but he is always there." Before Margaret could answer, Tom sat up on his pallet, rubbing his eyes. He looked at the empty hearth, at the neat stack of wood that had not been there the night before, and then at Margaret. "He came last night," Tom said. It was not a question. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it. She did not know how to lie to them, and she did not know how to tell the truth, so she said only, "Someone left us wood and herbs. That is enough to know." But Tom shook his head slowly, and his small face held a gravity that made him look older than his 7 years. "He came because he knew she was sick," Tom said. "Before you even went to the well, he was already out there. I heard him." He touched his own chest over his heart. "I heard him standing there. He did not knock. He just waited." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a quiet and unfamiliar ache. She did not know what to do with the image of a man standing in the freezing dark, waiting, not daring to knock, only leaving what he could and slipping away before anyone could see him. She busied herself with the porridge pot, stirring the thin oats with more force than they needed. "Eat," she said, her voice rougher than she meant. "Eat first. We will talk about the rest later." Greta came mid-morning, as the sun finally climbed high enough to touch the frost on the window ledge. She took one look at Lily, nodded once, and set down a small pot of honey and a bundle of clean rags. Then she sat on the stool by the hearth, watching Margaret move about the room, and said nothing for a long while. Finally, the old cook spoke. "You look like a woman who has been up all night fighting a battle with no sword." Margaret almost smiled. "I have a rag and a bucket. It is enough." Greta's sharp eyes swept the room, pausing on the neat stack of wood, the bundle of herbs on the shelf, the freshly filled water jug. She did not remark on any of them directly, but something flickered in her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the quiet acknowledgement of a thing she had long suspected. "You did not fetch that wood yourself," Greta said. It was not a question. Margaret's hands stilled on the porridge spoon. "No," she said quietly. "I did not." Greta let out a long breath. She looked at the children, at Lily sleeping peacefully, at Rose and Tom eating their porridge with the focused hunger of children who had learned not to waste anything. "There is a kind of man," Greta said slowly, "who does not know how to come in. So he stands outside, and he leaves what he can, and he goes before he can be thanked." She looked at Margaret with something almost like tenderness. "That kind of man is not dangerous, child. That kind of man is afraid." Margaret frowned. "Afraid of what?" "Of what it would mean if he stayed." Greta stood, brushing crumbs from her apron. "Some doors are easier to guard from the outside. It does not mean he is not yours." She said nothing more. She patted Margaret's shoulder once, firmly, and left the way she had come, leaving Margaret standing in the middle of the room with a warm pot in her hands and a cold confusion settling in her chest. That evening, the frost returned, harder than before. Margaret put the children to bed early, tucking the blanket around Lily one more time, pressing her palm to the child's forehead to feel the cool, even skin. The fever had broken. She would be well. She sat by the hearth for a long time after the children slept, mending a tear in Tom's shirt by the last light of the fire. Her fingers moved by habit, but her mind was elsewhere, on the wood, on the herbs, on the shadow she had not seen but somehow knew had been there. When the shirt was done, she set it aside and stood. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew she had to look. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the night. The courtyard was empty, silver under the moon, the stones glittering with frost. She walked the length of it slowly, past the well, past the stables, until she reached the archway fire where she had felt, that morning, the weight of unseen eyes. The ground was hard with cold, but in the shadow of the arch, where the frost had not settled, there were footprints, deep, heavy prints pressed into the earth by a man who had stood there a long time, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, waiting. And on the ledge of the arch, neatly folded, lay a soldier's cloak. Margaret picked it up. It was dark wool, rough woven, lined with a worn sheepskin that still held a faint warmth, as if it had only just been removed. There was a small tear at the hem, neatly stitched with coarse thread, the kind of mending a man might do himself, badly, rather than ask anyone for help. She pressed the cloak to her chest for a moment. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it under her arm, and carried it inside. She did not sleep that night, but she sat by the fire with the cloak on her lap, and she thought about a man who stood in the dark, waiting, afraid to knock, leaving warmth behind for children he pretended not to see. And for the first time, she wished she knew his name, the real one. The morning came cold and gray, with a wind that rattled the shutters and sent dry leaves skittering across the courtyard. Margaret stood at the window of the scullery, the soldier's cloak folded over her arm, and tried to find the words she had been rehearsing all night. They kept slipping away from her, like water through her fingers. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the footprints in the mud under the arch, the neat tear in the hem, the warmth still clinging to the wool. A man who stood in the dark, waiting, afraid to knock. She did not know what to call him, or what to ask him, or whether asking would break the fragile thing that had grown between them. Without a single word spoken, Greta found her there, still holding the cloak, and let out a long, low whistle. "So you have it still," the old cook said, setting down a basket of turnips. "I thought you might have thrown it into the fire by now." "It is not mine to throw away," Margaret said quietly. It belongs to someone.
It belongs to a man who does not want to be found, Greta said. She began peeling the turnips with quick, practiced strokes. Or perhaps he wants to be found, but does not know how to let himself be caught. Margaret turned the cloak over in her hands. The stitching at the hem was rough, uneven, the work of fingers more used to holding a sword than a needle.
Greta, who is he?
Truly. Greta's knife paused for just a moment. Then she resumed peeling, her face carefully blank.
I told you before, child, he is not dangerous. He is afraid. And there is a difference between the two that most people never learn.
You know something, Margaret said.
It was not a question. I know many things, Greta said. I know that the barley harvest was poor this year, and that the young lord of the eastern estates is trying to marry his daughter off to a man twice her age. I know that the kitchen cat has been stealing cream from the dairy for 3 winters now, and no one has had the heart to stop her.
Greta! The old cook set down her knife and looked at Margaret squarely. There was something in her eyes that Margaret had never seen before. Not warning, not pity, but a kind of careful, weary tenderness. There are names that are not spoken lightly in this palace, Greta said, and there are men who carry their titles like a second skin, so heavy that they forget there is a man underneath. When you find out who he is, and you will, child, you will, I want you to respond but what I am about to tell you.
Margaret waited. Whatever you learn, Greta said, do not let it change what you have already seen with your own eyes. The man who stood in the mud waiting, afraid to knock, that man is real. The rest is just weather.
She picked up her knife again and went back to the turnips, as if she had said nothing at all. The rumor reached the kitchens by midday, carried in by a scullery boy with wide eyes and a voice that shook. They said the Alpha King had been seen in the lower courtyards, walking alone, asking questions about a woman with a gray-blue apron and a basket of bread. They said he had been looking for someone for weeks, and that no one knew who she was or why he wanted her. Margaret listened in silence, her hands deep in the wash water, and felt something cold settle in her chest. The lower courtyards, the woman with the apron, the bread. There was only one woman in the palace who spent her mornings feeding children in the alleys, and only one basket that had a frayed handle and a red cloth lining, hers. She is not the only woman with a gray apron, one of the kitchen maids said, loudly, too loudly, glancing at Margaret. It could be anyone. Anyone does not feed the children everyone ignores, another maid muttered. Anyone does not spend her own wages on flour to make bread for orphans. Margaret kept her hands in the water and said nothing, but her fingers had gone cold, and it was not from the wash. The children felt the change before she did. Tom came to find her in the late afternoon, his face pitched with a worry that made him look far older than his 7 years. Lily and Rose followed close behind him, their small hands tangled together, their eyes darting to the shadows between the buildings. There are men asking questions, Tom said. Men in dark cloaks walking through the alleys. They stopped us in the courtyard and asked where we live and who takes care of us. Margaret knelt down and took his shoulders gently.
What did you tell them?
I told them we live in the corner by the kitchens and that you take care of us and that you are the kindest person in the whole palace. He looked up at her, his chin trembling just a little. Was that wrong? Are you in trouble?
No, Margaret said firmly,
pulling him into her arms. Rose pressed her face into Margaret's shoulder, and Lily wrapped her small arms around Margaret's waist. And for a moment they stood there, a tangle of children and a woman in a gray-blue apron, holding each other against a world that was suddenly full of questions.
Listen to me,
Margaret said, her voice low and steady. No matter what anyone asks you, you tell them the truth. You tell them that I am your friend, and that you are my children in every way that matters. And if anyone tries to take you away from me— She stopped, swallowed, and finished in a whisper. They will have to go through me first. Tom nodded against her shoulder. Rose sniffled. Lily held on tighter. And in the doorway, just out of sight, a man in a soldier's cloak stood with his hand pressed against the stone wall, watching, listening, and saying nothing. He had come to return the kindness he had seen. He had come to ask her name, at last, before the storm broke over all of them. But standing there, watching her hold his children whom she had fed and loved and protected without ever knowing whose blood ran in their veins, he found that he could not move, could not speak, could not do anything but stand in the shadow and let the weight of what she was pressed down on him like a mountain.
The evening came cold and dark, and the palace corridors grew quiet. Margaret carried the folded cloak under her arm and walked to the arch by the woodpile where she had found it 2 nights before. She did not know if he would come. She did not know if he had ever been real, or if she had imagined the warmth in the wool, the footprints in the mud, the thickness of his shadow in the dark. She stood there for a long time, the wind biting at her cheeks, and was about to turn and go back inside when she heard it. A step, soft, deliberate, a man's weight on the dry leaves. She turned. He stood at the edge of the arch, half in shadow, half in the pale light of the rising moon. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and gray eyes that caught the moonlight like old steel. There was a scar through his left eyebrow, pale against his skin, and he wore no crown, no crimson cloak, nothing but a plain soldier's tunic, and the unmistakable weight of a man who was used to being obeyed. He looked at her. She looked at him. And for the first time, he was not the stranger in the shadows, and she was not the woman who fed children in the alleys. They were just 2 people, standing in the cold, holding something fragile between them that neither of them knew how to name. "You left this," Margaret said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She held out the cloak. He took it from her, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. He did not look at the cloak. He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low, rough, like a man who had not spoken much in a long time. "For finding it, for keeping it." "It kept me warm," Margaret said. "The night I could not sleep." Something flickered in his gray eyes. A question, a hope, a fear. "I am called Arthur," he said. "I know it is not much of a name, but it is mine, for now." Margaret looked at him, at the scar through his eyebrow, at the way he held his shoulders like a man bracing against a blow, and felt something break open in her chest. "For now?" she repeated. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very softly, "I have not been honest with you, and I think the time is coming when I will have to be." He did not say more, but he did not leave, either. He stood there in the cold with her, the cloak folded over his arm, and let the silence speak the words he could not yet say. The autumn wind had teeth that night. Margaret was crossing the yard behind the kitchens, a half-empty basket of bread on her arm, when a tall figure stepped out of the shadow of the woodpile. Her heart seized, then settled. It was Arthur. He wore no cloak this time, only the plain tunic of a soldier, and his gray eyes were bright with something she had never seen in them before. "I was coming to find you," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant. "The children asked about you. Tom wanted to know if the soldier with the scar would come back." He did not answer. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he is about to do something he has been dreading for a long time. Then he reached into his belt and drew out a small, tarnished thing. It caught the light of the kitchen torch. It was her mother's silver spoon. "How did you—" she began, but the words died in her throat. He was holding it wrong, by the bowl, the way you hold a thing you do not want to touch. And he was looking at the handle, at the small crest worn smooth by years of polishing. A wolf's head, crowned with a branch of ash. "This crest," he said, his voice rough as stone. "Do you know what it is?" "It is my mother's," she said. "It came from a lady she once served, a long time ago before I was born." "Your mother served the Lady of Ashford," William said, and his voice cracked on the name, as if it cost him something to say it out loud. "The lady was my wife. She gave that spoon to your mother on the day your mother was married. It was her way of saying, 'You are not a servant to me. You are family.'" Margaret felt the world tilt. She reached out and gripped the edge of the woodpile. The spoon hung between them, small and gleaming, and suddenly it was not a spoon at all. It was a thread, pulling her through years and walls and silences to the man standing in front of her. "You are not Arthur," she whispered. "No," he said. "I am not." He did not say his name. He did not have to. She had heard it in the kitchens, in the whispers of the servant girls, in the way Greta's voice dropped low and careful when she spoke of the Alpha King. She had heard it in the way the guards straightened when he walked past, the way the whole castle seemed to hold its breath when he entered a room. "I am the father of the children you have been feeding," he said. I am the man who has been watching you from the shadows for 3 months. I am the coward who could not look at his own children, so he let a stranger do it for him." His voice broke on the last word. He turned his face away, and Margaret saw his jaw clench, the scar through his eyebrow pulling tight. "They are yours," she said. It was not a question. She knew it the way she knew the weight of bread in her hands. Lily and Rose. And Tom. He said their names like they hurt him. "They are mine, and I have not spoken to them since their mother died." Margaret thought of the children, of Tom's fierce little face, of Lily's partic way of watching, of Rose's laugh that came out like a bell when she was not expecting it. She thought of the way they ate, hunched and quick, as if they were afraid the food would be taken away. She thought of the way they never spoke of a mother, never spoke of a father, never spoke of a home. "Why?" she said, and her voice was not gentle now. It was sharp, the way a knife is sharp. "Why would you leave them alone like that?" William took a step back as if she had struck him. And then he did something Margaret had never seen a king do. He sat down on the edge of the woodpile, in the dirt, and put his face in his hands. "Because she died," he said. "Because she died. And I did not know how to be both. I did not know how to be a father and a king and a man all at once. So I chose to be none of them. I chose to be nothing." The wind moved through the yard, carrying the smell of wood smoke and turning leaves. Margaret stood very still, her hands wrapped around the spoon, and felt the shape of his grief pressing against her. "I used to watch her sing to them," he said. "My wife. I would stand in the doorway and watch her sing to the children, and I would think, she is the whole world, and I am just the walls around it. And when she died, I did not know how to be the song. So I stopped being anything at all." Margaret looked out at the spoon in her hands, the wolf's head worn smooth, the ash branch thin and patient. "She gave this to my mother," Margaret said slowly, "because she was kind." "She was kind," William said. "She was the kindest person I have ever known, and I have spent 3 years trying to forget that I was ever loved by her, because remembering it felt like bleeding." He looked up then, and his gray eyes were wet. "I watched you feed them," he worked.
Said, "I watched you give them your last piece of bread. I watched you sing to them, the way she used to sing, and I thought, this woman is doing what I should have done. I thought, this woman is more of a parent to my children than I have ever been." Margaret's throat tightened. She thought of the children, of their hungry faces, of the way they had become the center of her days without her even noticing. "I did not know they were yours," she said. "I fed them because they were hungry, because they were small, and the world was cold, and I could not bear to watch them go without." "I know," he said. "That is why I could not tell you. Because if I had told you, you might have stopped. You might have been afraid. And they needed someone who was not afraid." The door of the kitchen creaked open. Margaret turned, and there they were, Tom, with his fierce little face, and Lily and Rose, holding hands, their eyes wide in the torchlight. They had heard. They had come. "Tom," William said, and his voice cracked on the name. "Lily, Rose." The children did not move. They stood in the doorway looking at the man who was their father, the man they had only ever seen from a distance, the man who had always been a rumor and never a face. Margaret knelt down in the dirt. She held out her arms. "Come here," she said gently. "Come here, little ones. He is not a stranger. He is your father, and he has been watching over you, even when you could not see him." Tom stepped forward first, slowly, like a boy approaching a wild animal. Then Lily, then Rose, who was crying, silent tears running down her round cheeks. William, Rose. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides and knelt in front of them, his big hands trembling. "I am sorry," he said. "I am so sorry. I should have been here, should have been your father. I was too afraid, I was too broken. But I am here now, and I will not leave you again, I swear it." Tom reached out and touched the scar through William's eyebrow. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "Not any more," William said, and he gathered all three of them into his arms, and he held them the way a man holds something he has been carrying for too long and has finally set down. Margaret stood, watching. The spoon was warm in her hand. She thought of her mother, and of the lady who had given the spoon, and of all the small kindnesses that passed from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from stranger to stranger, and how they held the world together. William looked up at her. His eyes were wet, and his voice was bare. "Margaret," he said, "I have no right to ask, but I am asking. Stay with them. Stay with me, not as a servant, not as a stranger, as someone who belongs." Margaret looked at the children in his arms, at Tom's fierce face, at Lily's quiet eyes, at Rose's wet cheeks, and she thought of the empty bed in her small room, of the loneliness she had carried for so long she had stopped noticing it. "I fed them because they were hungry," she said. "I did not feed them to be thanked. I did not feed them to be loved." "I know," he said. "That is why I am asking." The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere in the kitchens, Greta began to sing, low and tuneless, the way she did when she was pretending not to listen. Margaret looked at the spoon in her hand, at the wolf's head, worn smooth, at the ash branch, thin and patient. "Okay," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried. "Okay, I will stay, but not because you asked, because they are hungry, and because you are hungry too." She knelt down beside him in the dirt and reached found and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers tight, the way a drowning man holds onto a rope. "You were a hungry child too, once," she said very softly, "and someone fed you, and now you are going to learn how to feed someone else." William bowed his head, and in the torchlight, in the dirt, in front of the children he had been too afraid to love, the Alpha King of Thornwick wept. The first snow came on a morning when the world had gone quiet. Margaret woke before dawn, as she always did, and for a moment she forgot where she was. The ceiling above her was not the low, smoke-stained beams of the servants' quarters. The blanket over her was not her own thin wool one, but a heavier thing, woven with the Ashford wolf in deep crimson. She lay still, letting the strangeness settle. And then she remembered. She had not left. And he had not let her go. The room she had been given was small, but the fire was lit, and on the little table by the window sat a clay ball of honey and a loaf of bread still warm from the ovens. She did not know who had left them. She did not ask. She dressed in her old grey-blue dress, the one with the patched sleeves. It felt right, somehow, to wear it today. She pinned her hair back the way she always had, and she went down the corridor toward the kitchens. She had not gone 3 steps before she heard the laughter. It came from the great hall, and it was a sound that did not belong there. The great hall was for feasts and judgments, and the cold business of ruling. It was not for laughter. And yet there it was, bright and unashamed, bouncing off the stone pillars. She stopped at the doorway. The fire in the great hearth had been lit, and around it, on the flagstones, sat the Alpha King of Thornwick with his back to her, cross-legged lead, the Kager. A boy, Ton, was on his shoulders, gripping his hair with both fists, shrieking with delight as William pretended to stumble. Lily and Rose were on the floor in front of him, each clutching a wooden spoon they were using to bang on an overturned pot. "Again, Papa, again!" Ton yelled, and William, the man who could order a village burned with a word, the man whose name made grown soldiers lower their eyes, crouched low and staggered and roared like a wounded bear, and Tom laughed so hard he almost fell off. Margaret leaned against the door frame. Her throat was tight. She watched William set Tom down gently, then scoop up both girls, one in each arm, and spin them in a slow circle until they were dizzy and giggling. He was not graceful. He was not kingly. He was a man learning how to be a father, 3 years late, and the weight of that was on him in every careful, clumsy movement. "Your Majesty," a voice said behind her, dry and familiar, "you are blocking the porridge." Greta stood there, a steaming pot in her hands, her face as unreadable as ever. But her eyes were soft. "Come," Greta said. "Let them play. You and I have porridge to stir and words to say." They walked to the kitchens together, the old cook and the new resident of the East Wing, and for a long while they worked in silence. Margaret stirred. Greta measured. The fire crackled. The snow fell past the window in thick, unhurried flakes. "You knew," Margaret said at last. It was not an accusation. It was a fact, laid on the table between them like a loaf of bread. Greta did not pretend. "I knew from the first day he came to your door with his split wood and his borrowed axe." She shook her head. "The Alpha King of Thornwick does not borrow an axe, child. He owns every axe in this kingdom. But he
did not know that I knew, and so I let him play his little game, and I let you feed him, and I watched the both of you circle each other like two lost dogs who had forgotten how to be found." Margaret was quiet then. Slowly she smiled. "You are a terrible liar, Greta." "I am a wonderful liar," Greta said with great dignity. "I have been lying for 40 years. It is the only way to survive a kitchen." She paused and her voice softened. "But I have never lied about the weather, child. I told you the sky would clear, and it has." The porridge began to bubble. Margaret stirred it, watching the slow swirl, and she thought about all the mornings she'd stood in the same spot, scooping the burnt bits off the bottom, feeding children no one else would feed. "If I had known who he was," Margaret said slowly, "I might have been afraid. I might have stopped. I might have been too careful to be kind." "Yes," Greta said, "and that is why you were not told. Kindness that is careful is not kindness, Margaret. It is bargaining. And you," she pointed her ladle at Margaret, "you are not a bargainer. You are a feeder. And the kingdom has been hungry for a long time." The door to the kitchens banged open, and Tom ran in, red-cheeked and breathless, with snow in his hair. "Margaret, Margaret, come see! Papa is building a snow wolf. It is as big as a horse." Behind him, William appeared in the doorway, dusted with snow, looking faintly embarrassed. Lily and Rose were clinging to his legs, one on each side, bundled in cloaks that were too big for them. "They wanted a wolf," William said, as if that explained everything. Margaret set down the ladle. She wiped her hands on her apron. And she walked out into the cold, clean air, into the falling snow, and she stood at the edge of the yard.
Think Fungdave, and watch the Alpha King of Thornwick kneel in the snow, packing a great white shape with his bare hands, while his 3 children directed him with the fierce authority of small generals. She watched, and something in her chest, something that had been cramped and careful for so long, loosened. In the evening, after the snow wolf had been admired and the children had been bathed and fed and tucked into beds that were still new to them, William found Margaret in the kitchens. She was sitting at the long table, the old silver spoon in her hands, turning it over and over in the firelight. He sat down across from her. He did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "That was my wife's." "I know," Margaret said. "She gave it to your mother, years ago, before you were born." He paused. "My wife was kind the way you are kind, without calculation, without warning. She would have liked you." Margaret looked at him. The scar on his brow was pale in the firelight. His hands, the hands that had built a snow wolf today, were folded in front of him, and they were not steady. "She would have wanted you to keep it," he said. "And I want you to keep it too, not because you are my servant, because you are the one who fed my children when I could not. Because you taught me that love is not a crown, and it is not a wall, and it is not something you can rule from a distance." He reached across the table, and he closed his hand over hers, the spoon between their palms, the worn wolf's head pressing into her skin. "Marry me," he said, "not as my servant, not as my subject, as my wife, as their mother, as the heart of this house that has been cold for far too long." Margaret was very still. The fire crackled, the snow fell past the window, silent and endless. She thought of the children, who had been fed and then forgotten, and now were laughing in warm beds. She thought of the man across from her, who had been hungry for so much longer than they had. She thought of Greta, and the weather, and the clear sky. She slid her hand out from under his. His face did not fall, but his eyes flickered, and she saw the fear there, the old fear of being left. She did not take her hand away. She turned it over, and she placed the spoon in his palm, and she closed his fingers around it. "Keep it," she said. "It is time someone fed you." And then she leaned across the table, and she kissed him, softly on the scar above his brow. And she felt the breath go out of him, the long-held breath of 3 years of winter. And she felt his free hand come up and cup her cheek, rough and warm.
"All right," she said, when she pulled back, laughing a little and purring a little. "All right, I will marry you, but I am keeping my apron." William looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and he laughed, and it was the strangest, most wonderful sound she had ever heard from him. "Keep the apron," he said, "and keep the kitchen, and keep feeding them. That is all I ever wanted for them. That is all I ever wanted for myself." They sat there in the firelit, the Alpha King of Thornwick and the kitchen maid, holding hands across the table, and the old silver spoon lay between them like a promise. In the spring they planted a garden behind the kitchens. Tom planted beans, and Lily and Rose planted flowers, and Margaret planted herbs for cooking. And William, the Alpha King, the terror of the northern borders, planted nothing. He just stood there, holding a watering can, watching his children get their hands dirty, and smiling like a man who had been given back his whole world. And every night, forbade, Margaret would sit on the hearth with the children gathered around her, and she would sing the old cradle song her mother had taught her, and sometimes, when she looked up, she would see William in the doorway, leaning against the frame, not intruding, just watching, with the ancient silver spoon in his hand, turning it over and over like a man remembering how to believe in something. "Eat," she would say to the children, pressing warm bread into their hands. "Eat and be full. There is always enough here now." And there was. There was always enough. Sometimes, the greatest power isn't ruling a kingdom, it's holding a broken family together in the dark. Margaret's quiet kindness didn't just save 3 abandoned children, it healed the frozen heart of an Alpha King. Would you have stopped to help when the rest of the world walked away? Drop a heart in the comments if you believe true kindness always wins, and follow for more heartwarming stories.